Good morning at Camp Joy. What a blessing it is to be with you guys from such a far distance. I am privileged to be able to join in here by video, and Lord willing, this will be a blessing and a help to you. My name is Matt Jones. I'm a missionary here in Thailand. I'll tell you a little bit about that in the days to come or moments to come here. I wish we could be face to face, wish we could be there and interact together and be able to answer some questions together and maybe even present some questions you haven't thought of before. I think that you guys are in a great spot. Looking forward to what is next to come in your journey to follow Christ as missionaries. And what an awesome, awesome time it is. I trust that as you've been stuck in the States through the COVID era, that this hasn't dampened your spirits too much and that you'll be able to press on and you're raising support and preparing for the field, because it is an awesome, I was about to say an awesome cliff you're about to jump off of, but an awesome opportunity that you guys are on the edge of, and I trust it'll be wonderful. I was saved when I was 17. I want to tell you a little bit about myself. Saved when I was a young man, sort of young. I guess some people get saved much younger than that, but I was kind of bounced around and growing up because my parents were divorced when I was 6, and then my mom was remarried, then she got divorced again, and then she got remarried again. And we went to a variety of churches, from Independent Baptist to Southern Baptist to Free Will Baptist. I was baptized in one church, Southern Baptist church. I was had my feet washed at a foot washing service at a Free Will Baptist church. I went to a camp and went forward an invitation at a Free Will Baptist camp and knelt at the altar because I thought that was the essential step for salvation, and left thinking I was saved. But I began as a 13-year-old reading the Bible. And I went through the scriptures from the Old Testament and then got really confused when I got into the book of Numbers and so forth. So I went to the New Testament, read through the whole New Testament, then went back and read the Old Testament, then read the New Testament, did all that over the period of 4 years before ever understanding what the gospel really was and before I was genuinely born again and saved as a 17-year-old. But God had plans for me. I was very excited about that. Again, I grew up in East Tennessee, very monocultural, very much just a country boy, and when God saved me, he gave me an opportunity to go on a missions trip to Mexico in 1992 or 3, that must have been. I went to Juarez, Mexico, and it was just amazing and eye-opening and changed my life. And on that trip, I said, God, if you want me to do this, I would give my life to you to go and just do this, because I had my life pointed in a different direction. I was going to follow a path to go toward being an athletic trainer, going into physical therapy, those sorts of things was what I loved even as a young high schooler. But God opened up the door for me to make that trip to Mexico and come back home and just pray and ask God through his wisdom to show me what he wanted, because I was willing to go anywhere, do anything. And so the Lord used one night sitting in my house reading through the scripture. I got to Ephesians 4, and when I came to the part where I was praying and saying, God, what do you want me to do? I just gotten back from Mexico in recent weeks, and the Lord brought me to Ephesians chapter 4 and verses 11 in the context of Paul saying that the Lord has prepared people, men and women, to do the work of the ministry, to go out and to reach the lost people of the world through the roles and the responsibilities of pastor and evangelist and teacher. And I didn't know what an evangelist was, but when I read that word, God just struck my heart deeply and said, this is what I have for you. I want you to go and fulfill the role of the evangelist. And I said, that must be a missionary, because I had never heard of anything else. And so I surrendered to that call to missions right there. I went and told my youth pastor that I was going to need to go to a Christian college. And he was a graduate of Bob Jones University. And so we visited there. We visited another school down in Florida and just felt like the Lord was leading me to go to BJ. And so I went there, majored in Christian missions, and that was in the late 90s. Met my wife there on the first day of our sophomore year. She was sitting across the aisle from me in a missions class, and I was smitten immediately, knew she was the one for me. And so I began to probably in this day and age, you'd use the word stalk, but it wasn't stalking. It was basically just carrying her books from place to place as we went from class to class. We had a lot of classes together. Eventually, guys all assumed that we were dating because they always saw me with her and saw me carrying her books. So they gave up trying to ask her out. They assumed we were a thing, and they didn't want to ask her out and risk, I don't know, the wrath of Matt, maybe, I don't know what you'd call it. But they stopped asking her out. And so by default, she had no other options. And pretty soon She had to just, settle down with me. And so we dated for a couple of years in college. And then the Lord led us to get married right after graduating from undergrad. The Lord also pointed us, after working a summer at the Wilds Christian Camp and Conference Center in North Carolina, pointed us toward a move to Kansas City for seminary at the now closed Heart of America Theological Seminary, where I did my MA and my MDiv. It was actually during that time that I started working at a little Christian camp called Amazing Grace Baptist Camp over in Ottawa, Kansas. Totally awesome place. So the Lord put us there for, 5 or 6 summers, and we worked there full time. That turned into a position of full time and leadership and so forth. Loved it very much. But always in the back of my mind was this desire, this urging to go to the mission field. And so as the Lord began to work through different circumstances and point out different things to me and my wife at the same time, we felt the call to go to Thailand, that the Lord was pushing us toward joining a veteran missionary there who had been on the field for 20 some years at that time and was looking for co-workers, looking for helpers, looking for people to join them. And this guy was a missionary, a veteran missionary with Baptist World Mission. His name was Jim and Kathy Hayes. And so we surrendered, or, talked to them about the possibility of joining, and came on a survey trip. And it was evident that the Lord was leading us to go to the city of Surin in northeastern Thailand. And so that all took place over a period of a couple of years. We raised our support in about 16 months, and were able to get to the field pretty quickly. It was a huge blessing. It was amazing. I believe God still works miracles in wonderful ways in people's lives. Sometimes the things he needs to teach us take 2 or 3 years on deputation. Sometimes the things he needs to teach us take the first few years in the field, and sometimes it's just a collection of all those things. But we worked with Jim and Kathy Hayes in an established church after doing a year of language school in Bangkok. And again, I say all this just to kind of give you the background of where we are and how we got here. So we led, when Jim and Kathy, they retired in 2011 after about 4 years of us being together. And we had about 4 years where we were in charge of this established Thai church, and it was not exactly what I wanted to be in. It was a heavy burden. It was really taxing on my language ability, a number of different things. And by God's grace, a Thai pastor came to join us. Now, Thai pastors in Thailand are extremely rare. I mean, they're almost unheard of. Actually, they're more rare than seeing like a Sasquatch. Actually, if you go and if you were a Sasquatch, you can actually, they have an online support system so that if you see a Thai pastor, you can report a Thai pastor sighting. That's how unusual and how rare Thai pastors are in this world. They're just that rare. So we were able to team up with a Thai pastor, and we came back in 2015 and 16 for a short visit to the States for about, 10 months or so. It was our second or third furlough, our third furlough. We visited a place called Maranatha Baptist University up in Wisconsin, and at that time, the Lord introduced me to, or I had been kicking around the ideas of doing a degree program beyond my MDiv, and so the Lord had a big change in store for us, and it was because of that visit to Maranatha that I enrolled in their online Doctor of Ministry program, and so that was pretty awesome. It began in 2016, and again, I'm going to give you a lot of this context here so that we can get to know one another, even though this is on a video. I returned to the field in 2016 for what was our third time, and we had really 4 full-scale life overhauls in progress going on. Number one, we had moved to a new town to start a new Thai church. We were going to plant a church, Brasat Baptist Church, and we had one Thai believer committed to joining us, and so we were venturing out into very, very uncharted waters for us. It was awesome. It was such a major life change, though. And then we began the formal process of working through that doctoral degree. There were 3 classes a year. Obviously, the demands for reading, for preparing, for doing classes, for doing the forums that you have to do before and after class, very demanding. So it's set up for a very, very high amount of energy that needed to be sent forth to, or put forth or used to accomplish that degree. Then also we were spending our last term on the field as with our family core intact. We have 4 children. And it was very, very interesting because our kids were speeding quickly toward the time when they were going to begin their transition back to the States. Our oldest was graduating. At that time, when we came back for this last term in 2016, our oldest would be graduating in a couple years. Our second daughter is right behind her, a year younger. And so we have 4 children. 2 of them are now back in the States, and 2 of them are still with us here in Thailand, ages 13 and 16. My girls back in the States, I guess I should have introduced you to them earlier. They're 18 and 20, both studying full-time at Bob Jones University. But the fourth thing that happened during that term, that 2016 term, was we were encouraged by some friends who knew our camp background to start a week-long camp for missionary kids. And I kind of initially drug my feet on that, wasn't super interested, but really all those things they all came together. And so you asked a question here. This maybe you didn't ask the question, I'll tell you. I forgot you didn't ask the question because we're not together. But I'm teaching this session, and I'm calling this session the ABCs of the TCK world. All right, the ABCs of the TCK world. And it really is, this session is a culmination of all those 4 things that work together that I just mentioned. The years spent preparing for the mission field in Christian college and seminary, then years spent in camp ministry, then years spent on the field, and then years spent putting all those pieces together and watching how they overlap and intersect. So here in this first session, I've already burned up, way too much of my time, 11 minutes here, talking about who's and whys. So let's jump right into the whats, all right? We're going to talk about the background of the TCK worldview. So you do have a handout there that gives you some of this information, but I kind of just put that there as a teaser for you to get a little bit of the information so that you could follow along with me. But I want to talk first about an intro into what I call an intro into the TCK world, all right? The phrase third culture kid was introduced in a lot of people think, it was introduced in the late 1950s by a lady named Ruth Hill Useem. She was doing PhD work in India, and this phrase kind of lay dormant for about 20 some years until really the guy I call the grand patriarch of the TCK world, Dr. David Pollock. He picked it up and began developing the terminology that's related to the TCK world. David Pollock, when he began putting all these pieces together and formulating these concepts and ideas that we're going to talk about today, he eventually founded an organization called Interaction International, and he joined forces with a lady named Ruth Van Reken, and they pioneered a book titled The Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds. And that book was groundbreaking. It was genuinely a pioneer work. It was amazing. It has been monumental. They have taken that book and done another 2 more different updates to the book. So it's in its third version. I still prefer the original. It's amazing. David Pollock was a pastoral figure. He was a man with strong faith. He was had a distinct Christian worldview. Among other missions endeavors, he taught at Moffat College of the Bible in Kenya in the 70s. So David Pollock, I say all this to point out in our discussion that it's not sourced in secular psychology or a non-Christian sort of cultural anthropology that would leave you feeling like hesitant to listen to the information that's out there. The folks who pioneered in this area, they did so with a strong focus on missionary kids and the effects of them growing up globally. So what I'm saying is that the missionary kid was originally the intended target for this discussion of third culture kids, and it expanded and has continued to expand. But I fear that I personally have historically been hesitant to make myself aware of the body of information that men and women outside of the Independent Baptist movement have done to help MKs. Really, I think if you're looking for information within the Independent Baptist movement that men and women in our group have established, you're probably not going to find anything at all. Really nothing that I'm aware of, almost virtually nothing at least, let's say that much, because I'm sure there's some out there. But that's why we're here today, for our children and for our families. And so what I want to do is to introduce you to a whole body of information that has been up until maybe 4 or 5 years ago foreign to me. And I wish I had known it when I was sitting at the orientation meeting with Baptist World many, many years ago now. I've been with Baptist World for over 15 years, on the field here for 14. And so I just want to pose the question to you: has Satan ever found families where mom and dad fought the battles of raising support, learning language, cultural appropriation, getting used to the culture, acquiring the culture, getting familiar in a host culture, church planning, ministry in general, and fought all those battles only to have their feet swept out from underneath them, or out from underneath the family, and ruin or end a ministry because of a child, a missionary kid, who fell under the weight of being an MK? Has that ever happened? Well, you and I know it's a rhetorical question, because yes, it has. And quite often we would phrase this in a group of people and just say, does anybody know a missionary family where one of the adult MKs has grown up or got into young adolescence and just totally the wheels came off and their life just took a nosedive, maybe leaving the faith, maybe making severe critical errors in judgment and so forth, that left them disqualified for ministry and have taken families off the field? We would all say, yes, we know people like that. It's getting to be so that the question is not, do you know a family who has had an MK tragedy, an MK problem like this? The better question now has become, do you know a family that has successfully raised all of their missionary kids overseas, and those kids went on to live for Jesus through their young adult lives? I think that is more unusual. That's the more amazing thing to find out in this world. And we just pray, guys, that the material that we're talking about today will put you in that category 5, 10, 15 years from now, or if you're depending on the ages of your kids. I want to see you guys be those exceptions where you guys are able to say, my kids grew up, loved their experience, and were able to transition with God's grace back to life in the West as young adults and pursue Christ through and in spite of and with and in response to their time spent on the field overseas. So with all that being said now, we've had an intro into the ABCs of the TCK world. And so from here, we really need to take steps to understand some of the established vocabulary that's inside this world. Truthfully, I hope that for many of you, this is a review. I hope that you guys have heard stuff like this before, that you've picked it up along the way up to this point in your life. If it is, man, you guys are miles ahead of where I was when I was in your shoes. And if not, I hope that you leave this conference with a flame of interest. I mean, a real flame of interest growing in your heart. I want to see you desire to understand this body of information to help your missionary kids and other missionary kids on your field that you'll interact with in the days to come. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what I'm calling the tools for your toolbox. All right, TCK tools for your toolbox. They're just things that if you've ever had to fix something and you don't have the right tools, it's a real pain. If you've got to try to modify a wrench to make it fit a wrong size nut, it's a really big problem. And again, I don't do a whole lot of mechanical stuff, so I speak as a fool here. But all that to say, this is what today is for. Today is for you. It's for acquiring tools. It's for putting stuff into your toolbox that you'll be able to pick up and use some of these things right away. Especially if you're on the break, on the fringe, on the edge or the precipice of going to the mission field. Others, these are going to be tools that you'll store away somewhere, and someday you'll pull them out because you need them. And maybe right now you don't need them, but these things are establishing your understanding, your ability to fight, your ability to fix things, your ability to address things, because that is an essential step in having a successful future. So really, if you see there on your handout sheet, there's a statement, there's a phrase, a thing that even saying it, I feel like it's probably counterproductive, but I have to say it. But these terms, when we're talking about these terms, these definitions that we're looking into, they are not creating a label. We're not trying to create labels or diagnose disorders of MKs. What we're doing is naming the experience that MKs have. We're putting parameters around the things that MKs will go through and your kids are going to go through without a doubt, so that they can then verbalize and explain and use the right vocabulary to express their feelings, their thoughts, their emotions about this experience as a third culture kid. So without any further delay, let's just look at this first word on our list, because today, again, we're trying to put tools in your toolbox, trying to introduce you to some terms that maybe you're not familiar with. We're not going to give you the broadest of all context for all those words, but I am going to give you a broad context for some of them, a broad definition for some of them. The third culture kid is number one there on the list. So some people, I think, will just jump right in here and say that there are some common incorrect assumptions. They're incorrect assumptions about the definition. We want to clear those up today, all right? Because when I first heard this phrase, it meant very little to me. And immediately you hear third culture. What does your brain run to? You think third world. And so that is an incorrect assumption. The term third culture has nothing to do with third world. They are not one and the same. A third culture kid can be in a very developed first culture, first world country, and still will be a third culture kid, a missionary kid that grows up in Africa, in the most remote parts and remote corners of Asia. That is definitely third world. Those kids are third culture kids, just the same as if your kid grew up in somewhere in Sydney, Australia, that is very developed. So that's an assumption. Another assumption is assuming that the third culture kid phrase is directly related to the number of cultures that the kid has lived in. It really is not at all related to the number of cultures. What does that mean? It means that if your kid has lived in Thailand and then they moved to Cambodia and then by some strange circumstances they moved to Paraguay, it does not mean that they are now 1, 2, 3, fourth culture kids or fifth culture kids or sixth. There's no such thing as a fourth or fifth culture kid. There is only the third culture, all right? So that's a misconception. Then another misconception, sometimes I hear people say that, I grew up in America, but in a very remote part of America. Therefore, my culture was different than some other cultures, so I'm a third culture kid as well. But that also is a fallacy. It's not true, all right? You cannot grow up in your own passport country or at least in your parents' passport country and be considered a TCK. You are not a third culture kid if you grew up in America, but you might be very cross-cultural, but not third cultural. And we'll talk about the difference later. So this lady that I talked about, Ruth Useem, she outlines the first culture. What exactly is it? We've talked about what it's not. What is it? What are we talking about for a third culture kid? The first culture is the passport country of the parents. All right, it's where the mom and dad grow up. If you have kids and you're from America and you have American passports and you're living there and you've grown up there, that is the first culture. For the second culture is the host country. It's the host country or countries that you go to live in. Wherever that might be in South America or Europe, that country that's not your own, that you do not hold a passport for, is the second culture. Then the third culture, here's where it gets interesting, okay? So stick with me. The third culture is defined by the other folks I mentioned, David Pollock and Ruth Van Rieken. They define it as a person, I'm just going to read this, who has spent a significant part of his or her developmental years outside of the parent's culture. The TCK builds relationships to all the cultures, while, this is important, while not having full ownership of any. So that is a huge definition. That's the original definition. That definition has been edited and morphed in the second and third editions of the book, but this one still is by and large the most widely accepted and the best. It says simply this: a person who has spent a significant part of his or her developmental years. That means kids typically under the age of 18, but really anytime before 15 or 16, your worldview is being shaped, your mind is being shaped. Little kids, especially boys, their frontal lobe is still developing. They're learning how to not be awkward in all parts of life. And so we're talking about during those developmental years, they're spent outside of the parents' culture. And why do I say parents' culture? Well, maybe if they were born overseas, maybe they have dual passports. Maybe they have Brazilian passports and American passports. But what I'm referring to is the home or the first culture as being your passport country. So they go on to say that the TCK builds relationships to all the cultures. They began branching out and building relationships out toward all the cultures, the host countries that they live in, as well as the culture of your birth country or your passport country. But while they're building relationships to all of these, they don't have full ownership of any of those cultures. They only have partial ownership, partial understanding, partial mastery, partial ability to successfully move within those boundaries of those cultures, and only partial in each of those societies. Whereas you and I have full mastery of American society if we grew up there. I know, even if I'm on the West Coast or East Coast or North or South, I know if I go to Walmart what products I'm going to find. There's so many things about America that don't need to be taught to me. I know them. They're inherent to me because I spent all my developmental years acquiring those things. Whereas your kids get pieces and parts of that, then they move overseas, then they go and get pieces and parts of that culture and that the customs and traditions of that country, and they begin to assimilate those into their worldview. Then they go back to the States for furlough, then they go back to the field and often change fields in between. So they have pieces and parts of all those cultures. And it says, although elements from each culture are assimilated, they're added into the TCK's life experience, the sense of belonging, all right, the sense of belonging, they say, is in relationship to others of the same background. And so when kids talk about how they belong, it's not so much about whether or not they were growing up in Greenville, Tennessee, or whether or not they grew up in Surin, Thailand, but rather their relationships will gravitate toward other people who have had the similar background of growing up between worlds, growing up between the two cultures of a passport and a host country. So this original definition, as I mentioned, if you look it up in the third edition of the Among Worlds book, you'll find different wording, slightly different wording. But the interesting point here is not that we're not talking about just a simple blending of two cultures. Okay, so understand this. We're not talking about you're American and you go to the host culture and it changes you and you become something different, but you'll always have a foundation. It's almost like your foundation of American culture is there, and then you build off of it. You add to who you are after experiencing your host culture. Whereas for young people who grow up overseas, we're not talking about taking some green Play-Doh and some blue Play-Doh, actually yellow and blue, mix it together and get green. When we take our kids overseas, it's creating a whole new culture. It's creating a whole new experience altogether, or where their Play-Doh was going to have blue streaks, it's going to have yellow streaks, it's going to have green, but then someday you're going to look down and go, man, my MK, his Play-Doh's got pink, it's got red, it's got orange, and you're going to wonder where all those things came from. Why? Because there has got to be an understanding that we have that our kids are living in a completely different culture than you and I grew up in. And I don't mean just that of the host culture. What I'm referring to is the third culture. All right, as your MK grows, his or her sense of belonging will gravitate toward other MKs, as I said, who've grown up between worlds. They've had this sort of existence that's between worlds. And that's not to say they won't embrace your host culture. They will most certainly and most likely, especially if they move there at a young age, embrace your host culture very, very freely, very, very strongly embrace that host culture. But they will develop into their teen years, young adult years. You'll see this play out more and more in their lives, and I'll say more about that if we have time. But here's some of the things I wanted to point out that are significant. Adult third culture kid, Marilyn Gardner, she said it this way in her book that I'll include in a book list at the end, or will be in a handout to you guys. Marilyn Gardner said this, and I love it. Someone invented a name, and she was referring to David Pollock. Someone invented a name with 1,000 meanings and memories. We became third culture kids, and we learned that we were not alone, that there were so many like us. We learned that it was okay to have a name. It did not label us as an infection. It gave identity to who we were and how we had lived. And what a great quote that is. It did not label us as an infection. It gave us credibility to who we were and how we had lived. So folks, I think it's a significant point to make right here. If you've never reached this conclusion on your own, your kids are going to be third culture kids. All right, they are going to, provided you don't get to the field and turn around and have to leave within a few months. And so unless you grew up overseas also, your kids will think, they will act, and they will view the world dramatically different than those of us who grew up in a single monocultural environment, in a monocultural world. Their ability to relate and feel rooted and to feel understood, it will be exponentially different than your experience and my experience if you didn't grow up as a third culture kid. If you did, then you understand what I'm saying right now. If we overlook this at this point in our lives, when leaving for the field, when preparing to go to the field, there's a strong likelihood that someday you're going to look at your kids and go, I have no idea what's in his mind. I have no idea, and I don't want to say wrong, but you're going to look at your kid and say, I can't figure out why they think this way. Well, a lot of time that happens because we fail to realize that our kids have a dramatically different worldview as a direct result of growing up between two worlds, between two cultures where they do not have mastery of either one of those worlds. So now let's work to narrow our focus, because this phrase third culture kid is actually way too large for us to talk about. Not interested in that. It really refers to a huge group of internationally oriented kids. It can TCKs would refer to military kids. If you know military kids that grow up overseas during their formative years, they are also third culture kids. International business kids, international teachers that go overseas and teach, their kids grow up outside of their parents' passport culture. They as well are third culture kids. Embassy workers, but of course missionary kids. All those pieces work together to fit into the big pie of third culture kids. Now for us, that's a big pie. We're not worried about the effects of growing up between worlds on military kids or international students, international teachers. Why? Because we're those actually, the TCKs are all part of a bigger pie called cross-cultural kids. And we're moving way far out. We won't get anywhere close to talking about that today. For our purposes, we're coming all the way back down to the very bottom level and focusing on missionary kids, because that's what we want to press on with. That's who we are. They are the ones who, like us, we want to share a biblical worldview. We want to filter all the issues, the thoughts, the discussions, the terms through a filter, through a lens of God's word, because nothing can answer the questions of the third culture kid world like God's word. And if we don't focus in on that specific fact, we're going to come to some solutions that might help us in the short term. They might even be long-term helpful, but they're not going to be able to change the life of our MK. So let's talk about some things here just briefly. What I would say, they're kind of the characteristics. All right, I think that's on your sheet there. Some of the general and obvious characteristics of a third culture kid. And eventually we're going to work our way down to talking about the missionary kids, but just general characteristics of a third culture kid. Simply this, that some or often all the time, that sounds funny, some, often, all the time. Yeah, whatever I'm trying to say there. Basically, when your kids go overseas, depending on your mission field, but virtually all mission fields around the world, one thing that's going to immediately stand out is you, all right? And one thing that's immediately going to stand out for sure is and are your children. Why? Because they're physically different than most people on the host culture, or within that host culture. And what do you say? What's the point of that? Well, simply this. When I came to Asia, I'm 6'4" and weigh 200 pounds. And all right, I hope you got that. I'm not the typical Asian looking guy. When I ride on my motorcycle that is like a little scooter that holds like 7 ties, it barely holds me. All right, I kind of am the motorcycle. I absorb the motorcycle. I look like a kid on a little bicycle, but that's okay because that's the way I roll. Get it? That's how I roll. But you know what? For your MK, it's a subtle reminder. It's a subtle reminder for us. We've spent our whole life identifying who we are as Americans, and then we're missionaries going in the field, and we don't have to develop our self-identity based on what people think of us on the mission field. But your kids will be reminded virtually day after day that they are physically different than those on the host country field. They will They will constantly look around and say, you know what? I don't look like them, even if I sound like them. And that's something that will affect the worldview of your MK. And we'll talk more about this, but just hang with me. Another thing, another obvious characteristic is that TCKs share the expectation that at some point in their lives, they're going to be required to leave their host country. They're going to be required to re-enter the passport country of mom and dad, which is typically, more often than not, especially in this day and age, that's going to be their passport country. I just hear of less and less countries offering dual citizenship for their people. And so what does that mean? It means that your kid's visa, they get to 18 or 19, they can't renew their visa anymore. They can't renew a work permit. They've got to go back to the States because they need to get a job, because they can't homeschool through college. And so they've got to go back to college. If they're going to live back on the field with you, maybe they've got to get a college degree so that they can be eligible for a visa to work overseas. This creates, especially in your adolescent young people, an ongoing sense of rootlessness. This is hardwired into the brain of your MK. It's often manifested with a strong, passionate love for the host culture. I mean, I've seen MKs who are just rabid about their love. They love their host culture so much, and to them, they were Zambian, or they were South African, or they were Argentinian. That's who they were, even though they did not look like the Argentinians or the Zambians. That was what they identified as. Or you might find this tendency to manifest itself in a strong dislike for the passport country. Man, you go back to living in the States, and your kids are seeing it, and they're used to going to church in sandals and a pair of khakis and a shirt that's untucked because it's 98 degrees inside. They're used to cows and chickens walking through your service. They're used to people nursing while they're sitting there watching you preach, and they're used to all sorts of church maybe being 3 hours long, or church maybe being 30 minutes long. And you go back to the States, and suddenly it's coat and tie, and it's formal, and it's hymns, and it's closed-toed shoes, and it's church in the morning, and it's church at night, and it's church at Wednesday night. And suddenly they don't understand what church is about, and they develop a dislike for the passport culture, not just church in general, but the whole culture itself. They can develop an unwillingness to interact with the host culture. These things happen. Why? Because they're realizing they're forced to go back as young adults, and a lot of times this constant feeling of rootlessness will manifest itself in several different ways. And again, this is the kind of thing that we would talk more and more about if we had hours and hours, but I'm down to about 8 minutes left in this session that I can use, so we're going to just kind of keep on moving a little bit. But all these kids, they go through life knowing that just on the horizon lies yet another major life change. That might mean right now your kids are growing up, grandma and grandpa are nearby, cousins are nearby, you speak the language and you understand what's going on, but pretty soon you're leaving for the field. And after you go to the field for a little while, maybe you'll do language school and move to a different city, a different house, a different town. Then after 3 or 4 years, maybe you'll come back to the States again for furlough. Maybe after that you'll go back, but you'll go to a whole different city. Maybe after that you'll come back for a couple more furloughs, and pretty soon the kids are starting to look out at college. And there's this sense that always on the horizon is a massive, monumental, life-shaping, ground-shaking change that's coming for them. And folks, I know those same changes that you and I go through as moms and dads, they they stress us to death. Like they run I had hair when I went to the mission field. Not anymore. All right. That's gone after my first term of language school and living in Bangkok with 10 million people. It's all gone, disappeared. But that's a personal thing that we don't have to talk about right now together. All right. So just messing. But again, a third thing about TCKs is that typically they experience, again, we're moving on. Typically, they'll experience financial privilege in relation to their friends in the host country. And you say, well, how does that work out? What is that? I'm going to raise my kids to live like villagers. Well, it will create a sense of disparity between the third culture kid, your kid, and local children. All right? You're a foreigner, and you flew there to your host country unless you drove to Mexico or something, or drove to Canada. That simple fact will likely separate you from a huge portion of the folks in your host country. They'll never have the necessary funds to travel internationally, to much less move internationally and set up a home and a church and run daily life outside of their birth country. So you got to realize this creates a disparity between you and them. And so what are the options here? All right, what do you do? Well, I know that I wish we were together, because I would take another long period of time and we would talk about the differences between having a missions compound philosophy that was prevalent early in modern missions versus having a full-on culturally immersed philosophy of ministry. Now that's one of our words, I believe later on we'll get into cultural immersion. But guys, I'd love for you to ponder the difference between having those two mentalities, those two philosophies of ministry, because they will affect your kids. So the point being simply this, as we kind of grind to the end of this first definition here, this first word, that Tanya Crossman, one of my favorite authors, by far one of my favorite authors, her book, I can't recommend it to you highly enough. If you're going to read only one book, read Among Worlds by David Pollock and Ruth Van Reken, and now Michael Pollock, who is the son of David Pollock. David passed away in 2005 of cancer, and his son now heads up the organization called Interaction International, and he's been involved greatly with the second and third revisions of that book. But I would recommend reading that book. Get that book, buy that book, put it at the top of your list, make yourself read it, buy a hard copy, get it on Amazon before you leave for the field so that you've always got it there and you can access it and read it. But if you're going to read two books, read that book, the Among Worlds book, and then also read Tanya Crossman's book, which I'm getting ready to say the title of it. It's called Misunderstood. The peril, or no, what is it? Oh man, now let's say that I'm going to tell you the wrong name. It's called Misunderstood, and then the subtitle is The Perils of Growing Up Overseas in the 21st Century, and you can find that on Amazon. Fabulous book, cream of the crop, top of the top. Will introduce you to much that's inside the TCK book by David Pollock. If you just want to read one book, read Tanya Crossman's book. It's fabulous. But guys, listen, that is what we're here for, just to get our feet wet, to get started here, looking into some of these terms and so forth. What we're going to do in session 2 in just a few minutes is then proceed to talk through the highlights of about 10 or 11 other terms, all right? And some of those, I'm just going to give you those names of those terms. Some of those things will be kind of self-explanatory, but basically they're like building blocks. We're putting the blocks together so that you can then build a foundation of knowledge that will allow you to say, hey, I'm interested in this. I've heard of tools. I've heard of things. I want to pull this out and read it. I want to be aware of it. So that's where we are for now. I hope you guys get a quick break, drink some coffee, get wakened up. Yeah, whatever that grammar might be. And we'll be back together in just a few minutes.